Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Jason Buffington. You'll notice that this week Dave Russell is not on this week's episode. We got an upgrade in the form of Karinne Bessette. Karinne, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So at Veeam, there is no one better to talk about our 365 story than Corinne. So I'm super excited to have her with us for today. Corinne is joining us from the state of Ohio. I hail from the great state of Texas. Our producer is in Georgia. I'm obliged to say that, by the way. That's not just me, it's a trademark term. Social media is being run out of Romania, and there's a lot of the parts of the world that are not yet green. So please, in your chats across each of the platforms that you're watching us from, please tell us where you're from today. And also, I kind of love to hear, how are you managing your 365 and data protection solutions for that? So we're going to be sharing some data with you from that. But please blow up our chats and tell us where you're from and ask any questions. Again, Rin's forgotten more about 365 than I'll ever know. All right, so but we do have some data, which will be fun to kind of even up that balance a little bit on. Let's talk about a little bit of the excerpts from, this is actually not from the data protection trends report that Dave and I have been covering for the last several weeks. This actually goes back a little bit, back to November of last year. So what do we got, about 2.5 months ago? From the cloud protection trends report. And in that one, we surveyed IaaS admins, PaaS admins, and today, Ren, we're going to be talking about some of the responses from M365 SaaS admins along the way. And so what I'd love to do is kind of pick your brain a little bit on what you see from some of this data and what this means for our landscape. And then we'll talk about some news that you have for us in the latter part of the half-hour session. This first one I thought was really cool because, for a long time, the number one backup solution for Microsoft 365 was the recycle bin. And I love the fact that when folks look on this screen, let me just kind of highlight up here, the only 3% of folks said we don't have to back it up. And that alone is a big change. 4% say the recycle bin. 4% say they're looking for something. So that's only 11% of folks. And then of the other 11, 89% of folks, they're doing one or both of these, with backup actually finally being the predominant solution of choice. Rin, it hasn't always been this way, has it?
It definitely has not. And I think the numbers was only about a one-third of respondents previously for the last couple of years surveyed, even from other analyst firms, were saying we actually do backup through third-party services. And I want to say there's probably a large contributing factor of we experienced data loss and it was not in the recycling bin when we went to go find it, or we weren't able to recover it back in a way that we expected or needed it in our environment.
Totally agree. We've been saying for a long time that if you use a mediocre or insufficient or a good enough approach to backup, you will invariably find that it was not good enough. And then you'll go and finally see the light along the way. Now, speaking of seeing the light, the two things we've always had to have consistent dialogues on is the recycle bin is not enough, and no, legal hold is not the same as backup. Now, I personally like the fact that about 40% of organizations are using those premium tiers. I'm just glad to find out that most of them are not really using it for the sake of backup replacement anymore. This is something you've been pretty passionate on for a while.
Correct. And I don't want to minimize anything to do with litigation holds or anything to do with e-discovery processes because they're a very necessary part of those E3 and E5 license when it comes to the compliance conversation as a whole. But in addition to those compliance conversations, and I know you have other data points that refer to other compliance is also requiring you to have data backed up to the 3 and 5 year mark in separate data entities outside of the organization's primary data holds,
Mhm.
which negates just those litigation holds, which are on the same storage entities, have the same privilege access points, which means it's not a backup. The same point of failures occur here.
Yeah, you and I have done quite a few Microsoft events together over the years, and one of the things when you first started really helping me understand where legal hold has benefit as a complement, but not as a replacement, I just kept going back to really old conversations I had 25 years ago when folks used to argue that snapshots were a replacement for backups. And a lot of things that you taught me over the time that we've worked together actually seems like it makes sense there too, because when if you lose a storage array, you lose not only the primary data, you lose the snaps, right? And if you have a compromised credential in 365, you lose not only the primary data, you lose the holds, right? So I mean, there's some similar kind of categories there. And again, you probably wouldn't keep snapshots as long as you would keep backups. You probably should not be running legal holds as long as you might be doing. I mean, there seems like there's some parallels there for just don't put all your eggs in the same basket, darn it.
Same but different, I guess, is kind of how we do this separation. They have similar qualities, but they have very different implications on how you use them in your environment. And they definitely don't have, on the litigation side, the ability to restore back to the original environment to get
Sure.
business back up and going. You lose that entire business continuity conversation, which I know you'd have a lot of conversations on here about.
And chain of custody, right? I mean, the ability to actually surrender data for secondary purposes, mobility. There's several things that kind of come out of that. And again, we should also flip that conversation over and point out Veeam is a huge fan of snapshotting. Veeam is a huge fan of enhanced tiers within 365. They are great complements. We were joking about Texas terms prior to when the conversation was starting. To me, this is belt and suspenders, right? There are some cases where you really just kind of want both. And I'm not going to paint any more pictures beyond that.
I mean,
But
321, we don't
three,
just
two,
keep
one, one,
one
zero.
copy of our data. There are multiple layers that you have in your environment. You got to build it like an onion or a layer cake. There's no one magic bullet.
Or a cinnamon bun. I'm just saying.
Whatever you, now we're getting hungry.
It is lunchtime here on the East Coast. So, all right. And speaking of the East Coast, let's see which meal that some of the viewers are coming in from today. So, I love when Canada comes in early just because such a big chunk of the map turns green. So, welcome from some of our friends in Toronto. I saw you chimed in. More folks from Texas have piled on. Colorado is in the house. So, that's always awesome. Taking a look in the old country, we got Austria. Text education may be failing me a little bit. Romania's in, Greece, Germany, one of my favorite places to visit over in the EU, UAE, Saudi Arabia. Where else we got? And is that Pakistan? Nice. It's been a while since y'all joined in, so thank you for watching.
And we got Denmark that just chimed in.
Love that, love that. And again, please continue to pile on and find your hardest question on how to protect 365 and see if we can stump Ren over the next time. Hopefully, some of the folks that are on for today are actual folks that are responsible for doing data protection of 365, which is one of the reasons they're joining. And that's probably a good segue into our next slide. So we've talked about a little bit of the how. Let's talk about the who. This is actually one of my favorite questions because often when you have something like an application-centric workload, there is a high risk of being either underprotected or overprotected. Overprotected is both sides are backing up in their own special way, and that sounds like a lovely idea right up until you realize, hey, now I'm consuming twice as much storage, it's not as well managed, somebody's going to get a budget cut. Right. So overprotecting is not always a good thing in the long run. Underprotecting is, oh, I thought you were doing the backups. No, I thought you were doing the backups. No, I thought you were. And so it's always a big question to ask along that. Ren, we asked the question, it's the same data on the left and the right. On the left is the aggregate of all the responses. And I do think it's interesting that we cut this data two ways, but essentially what we're looking at here is roughly a 2-to-1 ratio between the backup team is responsible for doing the backups of 365 versus the 365 admins themselves. So if you want to be purpose built, you can use it as is. If you want to use it as part of a grander solution, you can do that. In this case, the data was actually also cut if you were subscribing to a backup as a service managed service provider, a BaaS offering, then they're responsible for the backups about 25%, and the same 2-to-1 still kind of holds true either way. That's the top line data. What are your thoughts on how this lays out? And then let's talk about the differences in opinion.
So I feel like administrators wear so many hats today. I wonder how the admin that responsible for this identified themselves originally responding here. That'd be a very interesting conversation because they come in the door. You start in the data center, you consider yourself a data center admin, but maybe your entire job is working in AWS and Azure and GCP all day long. Are you still a data center admin? I'm wondering if almost 50% of these respondents are those people hanging on to being those data center administrators, still doing
That's
those
a good
types of
read.
tasks.
We often see that when a new workload first comes out, it's usually that admin who's responsible for doing backups because nobody else really even understands the environment, right? 15 years ago, it was the virtualization admin, that V admin, who was running backups, which thankfully is why Veeam is in business. Is because while the traditional data center team was doing all the legacy backups of physical, the V admin says, I have special needs. And by the way, you don't know how my stuff works. I'll run my own backups. 15 years later, Veeam is a market leader. It feels like we're in that same shift again. But the fun part is that after a couple of years, when the backup tools become more reliable and a little bit more commoditizable, that responsibility then shifts back again. Ren, I think when we started talking about this question a few years ago, the 365 admin was doing the majority of the backups for their own data. And it seems like we're seeing that shift back towards central IT again. What are your thoughts on the shift?
I think the shift is really around when the cloud was first deployed, it was this mysterious entity that not everyone was kind of on board with. We weren't sure if it was going to take off. And then, arguably, over the last 2.5 years, it was like it's a ride or die situation. You're getting onto the cloud in some form of on prem hybrid situation, and you got to learn something to continue being in IT, just like you're talking back in the hardware, your bare metal servers, you had to learn virtualization to stay in the game. Now you have to learn cloud to stay in the game. So your data center administrators have to now start learning that cloud and pivoting to be able to do those administrations of the Microsoft 365 environments in order to keep their work from home workers going, those additional workloads in Azure to offload the on-prem servers that they weren't able to get hardware for. They have to expand their knowledge base, and it's just survival in the IT game.
I like that. I like that. Speaking of knowledge base, I will confess that I probably could not have stood up my own 365 environment had you not been my on-call support and tutor along the way. So I appreciate you building my skills over those years. When we look at from the different perspectives of how this question got answered, so on the right-hand side is actually the same question, but we cut it by the three personas that answered it. So here are the three options, but then how did the darker green is how the 365 admins answered the question versus how the backup team did it. I do think it's a little interesting that the M365 folks actually think the backup team is doing the backups a little more than the backup team thinks they're doing the backups. Um, it's nice that this is pretty flat, so 20 to 24, so roughly 22% plus or minus 2 think that it's still the job of the 365 admin. So let's call that 1 in 5, 1 in 4 class environments. Actually, I would give a compliment out to all the BaaS and DRaaS solutions out there that offer 365 protection. I personally am a huge fan of one cloud backing up another cloud, right? I like the idea of you still get credential separation, you get smarter humans watching the screens than you do it, and I actually like the fact that the backup team knows that the BaaS folks are actually doing the backups more than necessarily the SaaS folks do. To me, that says the BaaS folks are doing it right because they're simply acting as an extension and outsourcing of that backup team. So I don't mind this because it's being made up over here, where the BaaS team is actually doing it in deference to the data center folks, which I think is smart overall. What's your opinion? I know you've spent a lot of time with 365 as a product set. One cloud backing up another, Baz and Draz for 365, pros and cons. What are your thoughts?
I think that if you're not comfortable doing the backups within your own environment, and it can be a very volatile data type in the sense that it can grow significantly overnight. And if you're not going to keep it within the cloud and you want to have that separation, but you don't want to invest in, say, another cloud giant like AWS or GCP, but you want that separation still outside of that cloud, going with another provider is a really intelligent option because you're taking that control back without needing to do those giant investments. And a lot of these cloud providers don't charge you that ingress and egress fees for
Hmm.
your data, which saves tons of money in the long run.
And we talk about those investments that you can avoid. I think we should talk not only about the investments from a software and hardware perspective, but how about the investments in time and skill building? It is not trivial to configure and manage and monitor and maintain the protection of a SaaS architecture. And so doing that to somebody who has this down to a canned service, and in fact, we're in the process of evaluating several Veeam Innovation Award nominees, and many of them are talking about what they've done to add value on top of our Veeam's 365 story to provide those turnkey outcomes, and really reducing the time to value along the way. Um, Speaking of value, let's talk about this. So we've talked a lot about separation. In fact, on almost every slide, we want to separate the credentials and the access of the production data versus the secondary data, which is going to lean us into why organizations. We covered the what, we've covered the who. Let's talk about the why a little bit here, because it looks like when a lot of these top answers kind of come back to, I'd really like to have separate data for one reason or another. Um, Candidly, these top three actually don't surprise me a bit, but I'm curious, when you first saw this, what kind of stood out to you?
I'm not going to say any of them really stood out too far, except that accidental deletion seems to have fallen down on the list. And I'm
Yep.
wondering if it's more of a pride in admitting that you've accidentally deleted something, because I will fully admit that I have deleted my fair share of data that I've not been able to recover. And I have intentionally deleted data for testing in the lab, and I know how easy it can be to
Sure.
accidentally delete data. But some of the preparation against cyber attacks is an interesting conversation because I've been talking about this one for the last year and a half. In fact, I helped develop a whole presentation around the sophistication and pivoting attacks that have developed. They're able to get into the environment and not just do damage to one user, but pivot in and change the versioning data and then version out all of the correct copies so that you're no longer able to get into the recycling bin and recover that data. And even if you do get into the second stages of recycling bin, there is no true indexing. So you're not able to really search and recover exactly what you need from that data, or you need to get a site administrator involved. And there's just all of these layers. It's slow. And if you do get Microsoft involved, you're not restoring individual files. You're restoring entire sites, and it takes days. So in that time, if you generate any new data on these sites, you're actually recovering data over top of all of that new data you generated with the old data and erasing any progress that you've made and losing time. So all of these scenarios and cyber attacks causing sophisticated damage to your data, seeing this at the top is very interesting to all of that.
So a lot of the elements of the scenarios that you just described, I think you could make those same cases around compliance and regulatory mandates around, how do I surrender data for e-discovery, and how do I compare what's in something I hand off to the litigators versus what's actually in the live data set, and how do I roll back just a little bit, and how do I hold just a little bit. But those same kind of ideas around cyber, I think this kind of brings us back to something that, Microsoft has said for years, and I think a lot of it's just we're too naive to focus on it, and that is it's still your data. right? For all the same things that you should be concerned about happening on site, you should be concerned about that stuff happening in a SaaS architecture. Rin, you bring up a really good one in that when we talk about cyber, it's not always about that meat grinder with the X and the skull and the hash that you see, on some of the marketing literature. In this case, it could just be, I've reverted all your old copies. You no longer have previous versions, and you no longer have the current version. I mean, it really, that bad actor scenario doesn't have to be around encryption. It can be just arson, as part of that scenario instead. So again, comes back to Microsoft shared responsibility model, right?
That's correct.
So all right, so there's lots of other breadth of reasons. So there's cyber, there's compliance. Gotta admit, I'm kind of happy in that third position. The better restoration capabilities than the built-in. Yes, it's better than the recycle bin. We own that. We're kind of proud of it. Central restore responsibilities. One thing that's actually not on this list is I appreciate the nuance of a purpose-built tool for 365, but if I got to transact a 365 backup separately than how I transact a backup for each and every other SaaS or other IaaS and on-prem, and there's just a lot of tools, and I certainly don't want to do that across a lot of vendors. Speaking of across, it's probably about time to take a look at the map again. Let's take a look at what's going on across our globe. Let's see, if we look in the U.S. or in the North America, excuse me, Washington is in, so some of our Canadian friends have run south of the border maybe. Ohio is now representing on the map. Let's see, Belgium. Great place to visit. And then down we look in the Southern Hemisphere, we got, looks like Colombia's in the house. And then South Africa, always love when my friends in South Africa join. That's great. Zambia and India in as well. And then if you look in the right-hand corner, you can looks like New Zealand is also representing. So thank you all for joining that, and please continue to pile on for this. Okay, we got one more slide as far as data goes, and then I want to switch gears on us really quick. Let's talk about where should the backup data live. And we don't have time to go through everything. The left-hand side of this chart just looks at where there is a regulatory mandate. You see about 46% of folks said there is no regulatory mandate for their data, which I actually find a little bit suspect, because if you were looking at data center data, you're not going to see 46% of data center data that does not have a mandate. But that being said, they do say therefore 54% does. But let's look at the right-hand side. When we talk about where is data going to be held, from 365, where it's going to be stored, I think it's interesting. It's nearly a two-way tie between, hey, I'm just going to put it in Azure storage versus in another cloud like BAS. I like that. You see some folks are going to bring it back on-prem. I actually do that. You've got me set up to bring my data back to Dallas. On tape, I'm a fan of that along the way. I think it is important we talk about Azure storage as an example, though. People might have the misunderstanding that, hey, 365 is in one rack and Azure storage is one rack away. It's, in the same building or on the same floor or whatever. That's not really how that works, is it?
Not really. So they may exist in the same data center in some cases, but not all Azure storage facilities are the same places. All of their other resources are kept. There are definitely multiple buildings in these different sites. They also replicate across regions in some cases. And if you go into any certification or any training that you start with Azure storage, you have options to do something called geo-redundant or locally redundant or region redundant types of data with Azure, which means you're storing that same data across multiple locations. So you can start to add multiple layers inside of Azure storage itself. Not saying that kind of solves the problem with privilege separation. You do need to be mindful of your storage accounts that you're using, maybe get different subscriptions if you're going to go this route, but you have options, of course.
Got it. So speaking of options, we got just about 6 minutes left. I should have said 7 minutes left. So super excited about V7. Some of the new capabilities, we're going to do a really fast one as a tease for this. Give us 1 minute each on these 6 new things that we're seeing for V7.
Let's do it. So we enhanced the storage around version 7 of Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365 with the addition of any to any object storage copy, which means if you start off sending it to any object storage, including your own on-premises object storage, you can send it off to any compatible S3 or Azure object storage, including a service provider and vice versa. We have also made the backup copies immutable. So if you have an S3 compatible immutability, a vendor that you can do this with, or Azure and AWS.
So I love that. Again, one cloud backing up another is super cool. And we talked about Cyber being the number one reason why you're backing up 365. The fact that you're using immutable copies on the backside makes a lot of sense. By the way, if we haven't mentioned it already, V7 GA announcement, take a look in the QR code you're going to see over these next couple slides. Hopefully you're looking at that. What else did we do for V7?
Super exciting. We've got our first platform integrations with
Whoop.
some of our other products inside of the Veeam ecosystem. One of them being Veeam One, which is going to offer some enhanced monitoring. We start off with over 10 reports and bonus, it's completely free for monitoring of the Microsoft 365 infrastructure. You do not have to have a Veeam 1 VAS or any kind of acronym of licensing for the Veeam 1 in our environment. You can install Veeam 1 from our website and monitor your Microsoft 365 environment, including community editions. We also are integrated fully into our service provider console. So if you do go with that BAS or DRAS that we've been talking about, our relationships with our service providers just got a huge enhancement where you're going to be able to manage your own backups, start your own application groups inside of their consoles, and have restoration integration portals, plus all of the additional features that all of our service providers add as their secret sauce into their offerings that they can give out to you.
Fantastic. And then one of the big pieces of news for V7.
Plus, our self-service portal got an enhancement, which is the addition of Microsoft Teams. In addition to Microsoft Teams, we've also added point-in-time restoration. So whenever you sign in, if you are a privileged user that's been assigned a Teams to be able to restore data from, you'll be able to restore within your scope any of those teams or other items, plus be able to choose any of the restore points available within the restore server to do those restore processes from.
So, Teams has been relatively late as far as we didn't add it in the first versions of it because the APIs weren't available. Today, I can't imagine any environment thinking about their 365 strategy where Teams is not a highly valued part of the data that has to be protected. There's an amazing amount of business that gets done in Teams. Speaking of amazing amounts, 50 over 50 different ways to recover data. This is a crazy slide, Ren.
I would have to agree, but I wouldn't call it crazy when you consider all of the different types of need for the data to get
Oh, yeah.
back in the way that you need the data back in your environment. When you're shopping for a backup provider, what you're actually looking for is a restore provider. You need to make sure they
There
can
you go.
restore the data in a way that you need it back in your environment, not just raw data formats, not just some type of weird integration where your pictures are going to look off. Make sure you get the data back in a way that makes sense to your environment and your needs.
I'm going to go be so bold as to say, look, when you're thinking about your 365 solution, screen capture this slide. And then whatever you're thinking about, say, can it do this? Can it do this? Can it do this? Can it do this? And you got 50 answers, 2 points each. That's going to give you a score. We get 100%. Let's see what anyone else does. All right. There's so much more. We could have done like a whole hour on that. In fact, I think in a couple of weeks we are going to do a full hour on 365. But for now, anything else that you're super excited about as far as V7 goes, other than the fact it's shipping? Dang it!
It's not shipping, it is already shipped. So if you go down
Shipped.
to the website
Yep.
today and go over to the Microsoft 365 side, you can download. And if you're not already a subscriber, you get it for 30 days completely free. If you want to use just 10 users license, we have a community edition that you can use free forever. And I've already updated my server, and I boldly updated the one I do live demos on all the time, where all of my legacy data is. So I trusted it.
I'll be updating mine later this week, and Ren, I might be giving you a call. Speaking of future events, though, so this is us signing off next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Dave Russell will be back. Dave is being joined by Krista McComber from the Evaluator Group, and they're going to be talking about some of the insights that Dave is going to be sharing and getting inside of Krista's head a little bit. In the meantime, for everyone else, go download V7. Go read Ren's new blog on what's new in it from the Veeam.com blog website. Ren, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure.
Otherwise, how does Dave say it? Stay safe, stay positive. We'll see you on the next one.
Our data's under cyber attack! Oh no!
The evil Hackface is at it again. What are Backup Boy, Security Sam, and Sass Girl gonna do?
All of our systems are vulnerable! And I accidentally deleted a crucial file.
Who gave the new guy access?
Have no fear, team!
Veeam Man, protector of the Dataverse.
With the power of Veeam, even an evil hackface can't penetrate our company's data.
But the new guy for sure deleted a database. That's gonna be fun to recover.
It was an accident. Fear not, careless new guy. With the power of instant recovery, your database is restored. What about my on-prem servers running legacy backup software?
No longer needed.
Cloud Girl?
The all-new Cloud Girl.
With Veeam Data Platform, our data's safe in the cloud. Welcome to 2023, Backup Boy.
With Veeam Data Platform, we're a team now, working safely and securely together.
Wow, that's amazing!
The Veeam Man Team Edition and Veeam Data Platform playset. Action figures sold separately.